Terror in the back row. With regards to the theatres and cinemas of Edinburgh, there are many. The city features a rich and varied past when discussing its entertainment history. In the 17th century, the Church of Scotland had traditionally taken a very negative view of the theatre, which promoted immorality. Enraged citizens burned down the first theatre in Glasgow as late as 1752 by a mob incited by hardline ministers. It was therefore a sign of changing times when the Canongate Theatre, the first theatre in Edinburgh, was successfully opened in 1747 near what is now Playhouse Close without significant incident. There was, however, a riot in the theatre in 1749 when English officers requested that the orchestra play a song celebrating the Battle of Culloden. When they played "You're Welcome, Charlie Stewart," the officers attacked the musicians and chaos ensued. Over the years, many purpose-built theatres and concert halls stood constructed. Many continue to remain today. The legendary Edinburgh Festival Fringe has existed since its inception in 1947. The month-long worldwide celebrated event has ensured Edinburgh's status as a world-class location for arts and performance. The rise of cinema brought with it many new locations within the capital. The Cameo is an Edinburgh cinema that started life as the King's Cinema on the 8th of January 1914 and is one of the oldest cinemas in Scotland still in use. Many cinemas and theatres have long since vanished from the streets of Edinburgh, but indeed their legacy remains. Many still recognisable beneath their faded façade. The visible ghost signs have long before covered up after years of change. Today we discover not just the ghost signs, but the ghosts themselves. Take a journey with North Edinburgh Nightmares to the venues of Edinburgh. Prepare for the sound of screams beneath the silver screen, the sound of ghostly footsteps upon the stage, the sights and sounds of terror in the back row. Situated between 18 and 22 Greenside Place sits a true Edinburgh landmark. The Playhouse Theatre opened its doors on 12th of August 1929. The 3,000 capacity venue proudly holds the title of the UK's most extensive non-sporting theatre open today. The Edinburgh Playhouse was the largest cinema building ever built in Scotland and still survives in its original form. It was designed by architect John Fairweather as a super cinema to include as many seats as possible whilst creating a unique experience for the audience members. During the 1970s, the cinema was closed as cinema going became less prevalent in the UK. In 1974, as a petition to save the venue was signed by over 15,000 people, the building, scheduled for demolition, thankfully revoked, then became a listed building and reopened as prime theatrical venue. To this day, the Playhouse hosts many crowd-pleasing performances, including touring productions and concerts. When the curtain descends and lights dim for the evening, the Playhouse Theatre stands alone in its splendid grandeur. The audience is now absent and its many seats are empty. Empty, but not unoccupied. The Edinburgh Playhouse is one of the UK's many haunted theatres. Staff members have reported seeing a man in grey, known as Albert, appearing on the 6th level of the theatre, accompanied by a burst of cold air. His whole identity isn't known, but thought to be the ghost of a stagehand or night watchman who killed himself in the building. Albert's ghostly existence first came to light in the 1950s, when, as one version of the story goes, theatre staff called police to report a break-in. The young officer, dispatched to investigate, found the stage door open and went inside to check and secure the building. On level 6, he met an older man who introduced himself as Albert, the stage doorkeeper. Having completed a fruitless search, the constable took his leave and headed back to Gayfield Square Police Station. The older man assured him he would lock up the premises. The next day, the policeman called into the Playhouse to ensure there had been no further problems. He explained to a younger staff member looking after the stage door that he'd been called out the night before and spoke to Albert. The ashen-faced stage doorman said that Albert had died sometime previously and that the theatre had been empty all night. On another occasion, an incident ahead of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 1997 saw Albert active within the Playhouse. An ex-employee confirms. We were talking to the police security advisors the night before the summit when a call came over the radio. The police sniffer dogs had been in all night clearing each level for bombs. The call was to tell the inspector that they couldn't clear level 6 as the dogs would not enter it. We joked that it was Albert, but the freaky thing was that specialists took us seriously when we explained the army dog handler called and army dogs cleared level 6. Jokingly, the staff member asked if this was because army dogs were harder than police dogs. No, came the reply, but the dogs based at the castle, so they are used to spooks and spirits. Put in that matter-of-fact way, it was quite chilling. In 2021, the Edinburgh Playhouse reopened. Staff members were delighted to return to their posts after a long absence due to the pandemic. It would not take long for Albert to appear as well. My contact, who has worked at the Playhouse for over 30 years, returned to work in May. While carrying out duties on the roof, drawn to a section he had not visited since the closure of the building several months previous, he would assess extraction equipment. He took a photo of the device and upon viewing the image, noticed something unusual. Does the frowning face of Albert stand watch from beside the extraction unit? I will let you, the viewers, decide for yourself. The RoyalLyceum Theatre stands at 30B Grindlay Street, near Lothian Road. The 658-seated venue was constructed in 1883 by architect C.J. Phipps. The Lyceum Theatre opened on Monday the 10th of September 1883 with the London Lyceum production of Much Ado About Nothing with Henry Irving and Ellen Terry. In 1929, significant alterations to the theatre were carried out, and in 1935 further improvements were completed. The theatre has survived throughout the years and remains a much loved and appreciated Edinburgh landmark. The Lyceum commands an impressive legacy of performances and an Edinburgh fringe venue since the beginning in 1947. The Lyceum has a ghost. The theatre, reportedly haunted by a woman dressed in blue wandering the light rigging above the stage, accompanied by a ringing noise. The theory is that it is Ellen Terry. Dame Ellen Terry was English, but her parents were of Irish and Scottish descent. Acting ran in her blood, as many of Terry's relatives were in the business, including an ancestor of Sir John Gielgud. She died of a brain hemorrhage in 1928 in Kent. Her ashes are in a church in Covent Garden. So how did she end up haunting the Lyceum in Edinburgh? There was a chalk statue of her in the Lyceum foyer. During World War II, the local government reclaimed the figure because of a shortage of chalk. Authorities carelessly smashed it and only her head survived. The tragic white head reportedly rolled around the stalls for many years to come. Could the ghostly appearance of a dark figure above the lighting rig be Dame Ellen? She is enraged by the callous destruction of her proud effigy so many years ago. Could there possibly be a connection with the existing head? Is she seeking the damaged piece of her statue to return to its rightful place at the theatre entrance? Terry also haunts other venues, including 2 London theatres, one in Liverpool and another in Wolverhampton. Dame Ellen Terry is most certainly an active ghost. A ghost light is an electric light left energised on the theatre stage when the theatre is unoccupied and would otherwise be completely dark. It typically consists of an exposed incandescent bulb mounted in a wire cage on a portable light stand. It usually placed near centre stage. Ghost lights are also sometimes known as equity lights or equity lamps, indicating their use. The practice initially mandated by the Actors' Equity Association. The practical use of a ghost light is for safety. A ghost light enables one to navigate the theatre to find a lighting control console and avoid accidents such as falling into the orchestra pit and stepping on or tripping over set pieces. An substantiated story of a burglar who tripped on a dark stage, broke his leg and sued the theatre for damages. Some claim that the tradition began in the days of gaslit theatres, when dim gas lights were left burning to relieve pressure on the gas valves. Aside from its obvious practical purpose, several superstitions are associated with this origin and meaning of ghost lights. The superstitious have various justifications for the ghost light concerning the supernatural. Popular theatrical superstition holds that every theatre has a ghost, and some theatres have traditions to appease spirits that reach far back into their history. For example, the Palace Theatre, London, keeps 2 seats in their balcony permanently bolted open to provide theatre ghosts. Similar superstitions hold that ghost lights provide opportunities for ghosts to perform on stage, thus appeasing them and preventing them from cursing the theatre or sabotaging the set or production. The practice also used to explain the traditional 1 day a week that theatres are closed. Some superstitions claim that the ghost light is in place to scare away ghosts, not to appease them. Many theatres, forced to close during the COVID-19 pandemic, have renewed the tradition of ghost lights as a way of indicating the theatres will reopen. The existence and story of the ghost light are indeed fascinating, with a nod to many superstitions and traditions of the theatre. It is a practice I hope shall remain for many years to come. As a youngster, I would spend much time in the Royston area of the city. My grandparents lived in Royston Mains Gardens. At the end of the street sits a substantial in length Boswell Parkway. Over the years, the road has featured shops, churches, 2 schools and a selection of local businesses. Many years ago, Boswell Parkway featured an impressive cinema called the Embassy, a cinema with a ghostly, mysterious resident. The Embassy Cinema opened in 1937 and operated within the Leith Cinema Group, State Cinema. William Albin was the managing director. His son Bill became manager later in the cinema's history. The building existed until the 1970s. The Embassy had fallen into disrepair by this time, following a fire on March 2nd, 1964. The cinema never reopened. The current owners applied for its use as a dance hall or bingo hall, but this refused. The building demolished in 1975, and its presence was now gone. The once grand cinema and entertainment centrepiece of the Royston area, a mere memory, but its legacy would remain. In the late 1970s, the plot of land where the Embassy Cinema previously stood converted to a modern supermarket. The Laws supermarket chain operated here until 1985, and within that time developed a story or two to tell about the shop. A previous resident of the area recalls the story of a ghostly figure who would appear close to the supermarket entrance. Customers would be alerted to the sound of fingers clicking as if to catch their attention. When the responding customer would turn around to see who it was, met by the sight of a man smiling at them, only to vanish before their eyes immediately. In 1985, the Laws chain purchased and converted to the William Lowe supermarket chain. It did not take long for the sight of the man clicking his fingers to materialise again. The witness I spoke with recalls seeing the apparition standing at the front of the supermarket in an area surrounded by a metal railing. Staff would use the section to store cardboard boxes for customers. He would click his fingers to catch your attention and then vanish with a smile. In or around 1994, the supermarket converted to ShopRite and QuickSave. It not known if the smiling spectre sightings continued. The Embassy Cinema location now, the Granton Medical Centre, and unrecognisable after its years of continuously changing appearance. The witness I spoke with reckons the ghost possibly connected to the time of the cinema's existence. The location of the barrier with the boxes provides a clue to the puzzle. The area would have sat precisely where the usher once stood at the cinema entrance. Could he continue to greet shoppers as he did when welcoming would-be cinema-goers so many years ago? The Festival Theatre, formerly known as the Empire, is a building with a history. In the death and life of the Great Lafayette, the fascinating and tragic tale is told. In the book by Ian Robertson and Gordon Rutter, events of a night in the capital that would change the history of theatre forever unfold. Gordon Rutter tells you the story.
The Great Lafayette is probably the most famous magician that you've never heard of. Okay, let's be honest, some of you will have heard of him, but for the majority of you, it will just be a name, if you've even heard that. But during his time, his name was really top of the bill. If you had him performing at your theatre, he was guaranteeing you bums on seats. We're talking the last part of the 19th century and chiefly the early years of the 20th century. The Great Lafayette wasn't actually born called that, surprisingly enough. He was born in Germany in 1870, called Sigmund Neuberger, and he rebelled against the family business and decided he wanted to pursue a life on stage, something that his father was really set against. And to allow him to do this, Lafayette basically ran away, and he did so in America. And he set himself up as initially an expert on the bow and arrow in America in the late 1800s and the 1890s. One problem with that is there were kind of a lot of people doing that sort of act. So he ended up working on the sides of stage as a stagehand, but as he was doing this, he saw other people performing. He saw how people were doing their acts. In particular, he saw quick change acts, and he realised exactly what was happening, how they were performing all their feats, and he started doing these things himself. He started imitating many other magicians of the time as well, which was a very popular pastime amongst magicians at that time, let's be honest. And he started to make a little bit of a name for himself. He was starting to do the circuits in the States, and he was just travelling around various theatres. And at one of these theatres, on multiple occasions, he met somebody who he had a bit of a friendship with, a man called Harry Houdini. And Lafayette at one point was totally down in the dumps and was wanting to give everything up, claiming he had no friends, etc, etc. And Houdini gifted him a dog, and the dog was called Beauty, and Lafayette was really upset about this. What the heck did he want the dog for? So he left it locked in the dressing room. He went out and he started performing his act. Partway through his act, unexpected laugh. Didn't know why. Looked round, and there's the dog, Beauty, actually escaped from his dressing room. It was a gift from Houdini after all. And Beauty was sitting there enraptured in the act that was going on, and the audience were loving the dog watching this. Lafayette was not a stupid man. He realised this was something he could play up to, and he did. And he became more and more famous. The act became bigger and bigger and bigger, until eventually he was playing all of the major venues in London, in Europe, in the States, you name it, he was playing. And one day he came to Edinburgh. It wasn't the first time he came to Edinburgh, but in 1911 he came to Edinburgh, and at the very start of the run, unfortunately his dog Beauty died. She was getting quite old by that time and had been overfed, quite frankly. And he buried her. He got permission to bury her in a human cemetery out at Pierce Hill, in fact, in Edinburgh. And the agreement was that when Lafayette himself died, wherever he was in the world, and at this time he was only 41 years old, his body would be brought back and interred with the taxidermied body of Beauty. And he was quite happy to agree to this. But, ever the professional, the show must go on. So Lafayette continued to perform at the Empire Theatre in Edinburgh, and unfortunately on the 11th of May the whole thing burnt down. There was a problem with the stage lighting, and it set fire to the curtains, and the whole set went up. The safety curtain came down. Unfortunately, it jammed part of the way down, creating a funnel effect, so air was being rushed onto the stage, which just totally fed the fire. The audience thought they were seeing something spectacular until the band started to play the national anthem. The audience then realised there was something wrong and left, and absolutely nobody in the audience was hurt. Everybody on stage obviously tried to get out. Lafayette managed to get out. He got out of the burning theatre, and then he realised that his horse, his pet animal, had been left on stage. He'd already lost one animal during that tour, so he rushed back into the theatre to try and rescue him. Unfortunately, the whole theatre collapsed around him and he was killed and never seen alive again. Eventually all of the bodies were recovered and the funerals were starting to take place, and as requested, Lafayette was going to be buried in Pearce Hill, little realising it would be less than a fortnight for this to actually take place. And his body was sent to Glasgow and cremated, and just as they were getting ready for the funeral, they found his body again. Lafayette had pulled his last trick. During his act, he used a double to perform some of the effects, and in fact the body that had already been cremated and was just about to be buried was that of his double. The real Lafayette had been found underneath a lot of the wreckage. The body was identified as genuinely Lafayette because of all the rings and jewellery that he was wearing, which had been missing from the body that had been cremated. Then the police were going to be called in about that, but now this was no longer necessary. So Lafayette was interred with beauty, and the number of people who came to see the funeral, the streets were absolutely packed. A few years earlier, King Edward had visited Edinburgh, and 3 times the number thronged the streets to watch the funeral of Lafayette. There were floral tributes from Harry Houdini, from a lot of his contemporaries, and yeah, he was the greatest name of his time. There are reports of a shadowy figure seen in the theatre now. Some say that is Lafayette, but there's absolutely no proof that Lafayette haunts that location at all. But, you know, if you go to the theatre now, just be prepared that Lafayette might just appear when you least expect him.
Broughton Street begins at the junction of York Place and Picardy Place. The steep stretch of road travels downwards to the direction of Cannon Mills. You are bypassing Drummond, the long cobbled East Claremont Street and Bellevue Terrace. The long and steep expanse concludes at an address known as Rodney Street. It is here that our story begins. The Ritz Cinema opened its doors to the people of the area in the 1920s. The cinema, built by Scottish Cinemas and Variety Theatres, a company headed by John Maxwell of Associated British Cinemas and ABC. It opened on the 8th of September 1929 with Al Jolson in The Singing Fool. The cinema flourished throughout the years as a much loved and appreciated local venue. Children would flock to the legendary Children's Film Foundation Saturday morning matinees, while many couples would become acquainted before the delights of its many performances. The cinema existed until 1981, with the final performance screening the cult horror movie Exorcist II: The Heretic. A week before, an attendee of the Ritz Rodney Street met with a terrifying incident. With the final reel finished and the cinema foyer lights dimmed, it was now time to say farewell to a much-loved piece of local Broughton history. Paul had attended the cinema for years, and this his final visit before the cinema pending closure. He wished his friend a safe journey home and watched them cross the road and catch the late-night bus. It was now time for our protagonist to leave the cinema and venture home alone. Paul, a resident of the Boswell area, left the Ritz Cinema for the last time that evening. The man bypassed the adjacent driving school, having missed the number 8 bus home. He decided to walk down to nearby Cannon Mills and get the next bus. He made his way to the entrance to what he considered a shortcut. The dark and narrow passageway connects Rodney Street and Eyre Place. The ominous pathway cuts through tall and dark tenement buildings and appears cloaked in darkness, even during the brightest days. Paul descended the broad concrete steps, guided by an old brass handrail situated in the entrance centre. The evening now silent, except for the sound of branches swaying in nearby back gardens in the cold of the night. As he progressed along the Vennel, the sound of his footsteps echoed along the dark expanse. Finally, reaching the latter half of the path, the man prepared to turn off and along with the blind spot which would lead him to the exit and onto Eyre Place. Suddenly, Paul froze in terror as the sight of a shadow appeared, moving frantically from the corner of where he stood. The shape moved awkwardly and accompanied by a terrible moaning sound. The shadow stumbled as if intoxicated. It slid along the wall and slowly into the path of the lane. The terrible, agonising moans of a man crying in pain filled the terrified man with dread. He stood afraid, anticipating what would finally appear before him that night. Then, suddenly, and without appearance, the sound ceased, and with it, the terrible shadow was gone from the alleyway. Paul, stunned and puzzled, did not hang about. Instead, he fled as fast as he could, and upon reaching the streetlights of Eyre Place, continued to run. The following day, he turned up to work as usual. Employed as a printer at Morrison & Gibb, situated at Tanfield Cannon Mills, he completed his work and left for the day. He ventured to the nearby Morrison & Gibb Social Club, where he joined the company of fellow workers. It did not take him long to recount the bizarre events from the previous night from the vicinity of Rodney Street Lane. His strange story merely met with ridicule and dismissed by all who heard it from him. That is, until recently. Paul recalled the story to me in recent years, and with some help, investigation commenced. Over the years, Rodney Street has witnessed a plethora of dreadful events. The murder of a shop owner in 1988 brought public outcry. The callous murderer discovered only a street away in nearby Eyre Place. The tragic case of an elderly neighbour discovered dead in her home. Upon further investigation, it found that her badly decomposed body had lain unknown for more than 5 years. During the 1950s, a brutal murder occurred in the vicinity of the steps of Rodney Street Lane. The victim, whose name is not known, suffered a terrible assault. The unfortunate man stabbed at the foot of the path by an unknown assailant. However, the unfortunate victim did not die at the foot of the steps. Instead, the dying man managed to drag his blood-covered frame along the pathway. Aided by the railings of the back gardens, he dragged himself to the opposite end of the alley, where he tragically died. The exact blind spot where Paul had encountered the terrifying shadow that night back in 1981. when the final reel concluded, the patrons long since gone, the curtain call of memory, the echoing of song. It is time to leave the theatre, the streets now dark and still. Tread carefully this evening, look behind you, if you will.